Welcome to Talk to Brazil with Tom Reaoch, the business connector to business in Brazil. Welcome to Talk to Brazil, the business connection, a leading Brazil business podcast talking about business in the world. I'm Tom Reaoch, an American living in Brazil, known for business networking and talking from my podcast studio in Campinas, São Paulo, Brazil. Today's guest is Ian Houston, and he's talking with us from his office in Washington, D.C. in the USA. Ian Houston is president and ambassador of the Scottish Business Network US, a nonprofit organization in the U.S. with the goals of supporting Scottish companies and organizations to access opportunities in North America and to bring together the Scottish diaspora across the continent, and also to advocate for American entities, investors, and policy decision-makers to engage with Scotland more deeply. So with that, Ian, welcome to Talk to Brazil Business Connection.
Tom, absolutely delighted to be with you. Thank you so much. And really at the outset here, let me thank you for what you are doing to bring people together over a long period of time, how you've dedicated yourself to networking. I think you're the king of networking, of just bringing people together through dialogue. And with Talk to Brazil, you have a fantastic product of connecting various people. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for all the networking that you do.
Well, thank you. And you've been a model to me, and actually the Scottish Business Network has been a model because that's really where I feel business comes. It comes from people, but people and persons being part of some type of an association, of creating a community. And now what makes our engagement even better is having spoken several times with persons in Scotland and now seeing that you basically are boots on the ground in the U.S., right?
Absolutely.
To help extend that. So tell us a little bit about what is the Scottish business outreach now, and what do we see looking forward here in 2021?
Well, first, the Scottish Business Network itself, I appreciate you identifying what the network is. Really a community of individuals coming together with a variety of skill sets to collaboratively work together to talk about how we support one another. And so the network at its core is about service, providing service to members and the larger community of Scottish organizations or the Scottish diaspora who are interested in engagement, in my case, directly with the United States. As I think about the future and the outlook, of course, we have this real dark cloud of the pandemic that's around all of us, and that's a challenge. And my heart goes out to all those who are really challenged by this situation, whether it's businesses or personal situations. It's a very trying time, the residue of which I think we're still seeing how deeply it has impacted the global economy and homes across the world. But I also see a market in 2021 as the vaccines begin to roll out of promise, of connections, I think, that afford an entity like the Scottish Business Network and what you do and other businesses and entities that bridge people together to support one another. The fact that those have been put in place and have really taken root is all beneficial, I feel, to the future once we begin to emerge out of this really dark situation that others are facing, that you and I are facing. Right. That I think the networks themselves, the growth of SBN, what you're doing with Talk to Brazil, other networks that are out there that have grown, I'm encouraged by that, because at the core of all those entities is a desire to help each other and to get through. And for me to focus on Scottish-U.S. linkages and connections is a real thrill, because I think there's great room for growth for Scottish companies here in the United States.
Now, when I compare business and cultures, one of the things that is striking, that's anywhere you go. If you go to Scotland, Scotland is also a huggy, backslapping type of environment. People like to be in contact. They like to sit down and talk. Brazil's sort of that way. We have the coffee networking. I like to sit down and have coffee with somebody. And in the States, networking is also social. And that being part and seeing people is part. But what I've learned this last year with the pandemic and looking to the plus side, it has been a learning experience to learn how to work and be successful virtually, to come out of that requirement that I have to be with somebody. I'm not saying that that's bad, but I'm just saying that we have to look at other opportunities because I agree with you. 2021 is still going to be a challenging year. And from a business standpoint, we need to survive remotely.
Right. And what I've admired, as I've said to you even recently, about what you have done, you came out of what you did in 2008, 2009, of that economic recession. There are similar attributes to the situation we're facing now, different situation, but still a real devastating economic situation. What you did was create out of that dialogue of how to bring people together. So I think we're in a similar situation now. There are lots of seeds that have been put in the ground that we are seeing growing of greater dialogue, of additional meetings that otherwise we would think would have to happen in person. We would have to fly to Brazil or fly to Edinburgh or
to Washington, D.C. to meet you.
Or Washington, precisely. And so even literally negotiations are going on between governments online, virtually. And I think all of that is positive in the sense that as we talk about the global environment and climate change, there's an impact on the environment when it comes to bringing people together through networking virtually, that we're not traveling as much. So I'm very encouraged by the role that SBN plays. And I've been always very inspired by my friend and colleague, Russell Dalgleish, who created the SBN network and community, along with Christine Essen, who the two of them founded this concept and moved it forward. And so I so admire that they had the vision of doing that many years ago. And now the fact that it had taken root was so important to deal with the situation that we're dealing with now. And so that's why I admire their entrepreneurship in creating SBN. They weren't anticipating the pandemic, but because they created a network, and what you've done with your networking lays the groundwork to deal with the storms, to deal with the challenges. Yeah. And
what I've learned, and you know that, and Russell knows that even better than I, that the world's just so full of opportunities. It always has been.
Yeah.
The part of the difficulty in the past was literally getting there and finding them and understanding them. Today, virtually everything's possible.
Yes, that's true. And I think for Scotch, as a Scottish American, as you know, my dad is from Glasgow, and so I'm Scottish, and I'm proud of being Scottish, but I also grew up in San Francisco. San Francisco, the culture of San Francisco, as you know, having been through California and LA, well, it's to be bold.
Right.
San Francisco is about boldness and entrepreneurship and showing that boldness. So I have an interesting mixture of growing up, my parents both being from the UK, growing up as a kid of immigrant parents who came to the Bay Area about 30 years old, being exposed to that boldness of Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and mixing that with sometimes what I feel in Scotland is with all the capabilities and all the remarkable talents and attributes of businesses and people to sometimes undersell.
Right.
I said, So what I'm trying to do is bridge what I see as a remarkable modern set of businesses across Scotland, innovative, entrepreneurial, across Glasgow and Edinburgh and Inverness and Aberdeen, just to bridge that success and those success stories, and to be more bold in the United States, which has a tendency, as you know, being originally from Pittsburgh, where boldness is important. And
right.
So I feel like for me personally, it's a driver because I feel so strongly and passionately about these talents that Scottish businesses have across sectors, and then to fit that into a climate where it is important to step forward and not undersell, but to be of a disposition of it's appropriate to say, look at this business I have, and look how extraordinary it is. I want to be that voice for businesses. If they don't wish to do it themselves, I'm ready to do it for them. So you become the lightning rod in the U.S. for attracting energy, right? And I like to think of it that way. Yeah, I mean, truly an ambassador for businesses, and working with all the partners that are here in the U.S., including the Scottish government, which does a fantastic job. Scottish Development International has different posts around the U.S., and there are so many different entities around different cities and states. But I do feel this is a key moment for Scotland to truly step up and deepen that lightning rod. I feel like I'm a part of a number of different lightning rods, like a thunderstorm of people who really are passionate about bringing this message forward for Scotland. And so it's a pleasure to be a part of it.
Well, looking forward, you mentioned environment, you mentioned climate, and boldness, I think, this year, too, for talking about the climate. Scotland will come out in a bold fashion regarding climate, right?
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate the reference, because as you and your listeners will know, the COP26 conference coming up in Glasgow in November, which is the UN Global Conference, the Paris Agreement that most people have been speaking about, that it was recommitted to by the Biden administration recently, came out of COP21 in Paris. So what I'm writing about, Tom, is the concept of when Glasgow comes along for the conference, the COP26 conference in November, there's no reason why the world can't say, let's create a Glasgow Convention or a new agreement that is even further than what Paris was. And
I think that's already happening. The fact that Glasgow is starting to be referenced.
Yes.
Also, you start putting a nameplate on it.
Yeah, right. And people learning how to pronounce Glasgow is important. That's I think I've heard a couple of different pronunciations, which is fine.
Well, they all work. I've learned that in my life, that all of them work. So,
yes. You being from Pittsburgh, of course, sometimes we'll hear people from Scotland say Pittsburgh. Like they want to say Edinburgh, but or if they're from Pittsburgh, they go to Edinburgh, they want to say Edinburgh.
Right.
No, it's not like Pittsburgh. It's Edinburgh.
I know.
Anyway,
I have the same problem. But my last name, Reaoch, is Scottish. So
nice.
I have the problem of the only place in the whole world that anybody pronounces it correctly is in the UK and in Scotland. Because since it has three vowels together, everybody, here in Brazil anyway, they sort of take one out because they think it's wrong.
Yeah.
So, but in any sense, I think you have to find a way to be remembered. And,
for me, Brazil is attractive. Of course, you will know, having been there for 50 years or so, that Brazil has this large stock of surface freshwater, the largest in the world. Right. And I see a bridge between Scottish businesses and Brazilian businesses who are focused specifically on that technology and managing water, because Brazil has that unique attribute of surface freshwater. Well, Scotland has 1.9% of the land surface of Scotland is covered by fresh water. It's about 70% of the area, 90% of the volume of all the UK's inland surface water is found in Scotland.
Wow.
And so that's a lot of water. And so what has happened as a result of that water climate and industry is real innovation of how to manage water and how to use it as it relates to the climate question. I would love to see deeper connections between Brazilian businesses based on the water culture in Brazil and Scottish businesses based on the unique situation there with water, to connect specifically Brazilians and Scots and businesses and research institutions about water, how to manage water, how to use innovation and share best practices. And Scotland has a great, I think, a great story to tell with how it has done. It's a real leader when it comes to managing water. And
no, I see those are stories, like I said, of the underselling. Obviously, those have been there. It's not only water; it's also wind. So if you take a look at Scotland and seeing, how you can do so much with theoretically so little. I think that's an example, and I think that's going to be the high point now this coming year with the events in Scotland, in Glasgow, is to show that, make that become more evident, and putting it really on the first page now. I think that Scotland will come to the first page now.
Yes. My friend and colleague Gavin Tweedy has just been appointed the first chairman of the Scottish Net Zero Community, which is a group of individuals and organizations that are dedicated to supporting Scottish businesses on their journey to a net zero carbon future. And so what the Scottish Net Zero Community is basically, it's an initiative that Scottish Business Network has supported and is moving forward. And we're proud of it, and it's just starting out, it will be a lead up to COP26. But, I say it's not just 1 week in November that's it, and then everyone goes home and we're finished with the environment. It's an ongoing conversation. When the COP conference was postponed in Glasgow, it was to happen well before this year. I felt like, well, that's interesting. I understand that we needed to cancel it. That was an appropriate decision. But I also felt like you can't cancel dialogue and discussion about the need to address the environment right now. It doesn't only have to be limited to a conference in November. It's an ongoing dialogue. So let's be creative about keeping the discussion. So I don't think all roads end in November 2021 in Glasgow. People are moving towards it. It's exciting. It will spark a future of a very ambitious plan going forward that will forever be linked to Glasgow. That's how I see it.
No, and I'm sure, and I agree with you. And as I mentioned, putting Scotland on the first page.
Yes.
I do want to mention you also are a writer for a newspaper, for the Herald Scotland.
I do.
So
yes.
there is still the newspaper to be read, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Herald is a great publication alongside lots of different publications in Scotland, including the Scotsman and different publications that are trying to get the message out. As you say, yes, I'm glad that people are still reading traditional news and writing. And so it's a pleasure for me to have a letter from America that I write each month for the Herald. So I address a number of different topics. It could be trade, cultural issues, environmental issues, and so it's a real opportunity for me to include a variety of topics, and the linkages between Scotland and the United States just run so deep, and so this letter from America, it's just a real privilege to be able to write that and to include people that I interact with, listen to them, and capture a variety of things. My next column, Tom, will be coming out in 2 days. I won't get into it too much, but it's the linkages between Robert Burns and Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
Because President's Day is coming up next week, and so I've written about those remarkable linkages between Lincoln and Burns. So
I want to recently you you had the Business in Burns
yes.
webinar seminar that I actually was able to listen
Thank
and
you.
participate to some.
Thank you.
And what amazed me, and I have to admit that I know very little bit about Burns, but what struck me from what was said, that he is considered an internationalist by heart and by soul.
Yes.
But he had only been out of Scotland, I think, once.
That's right.
So it just goes back to the point that I made. You don't have to travel to be international.
Exactly.
So I think that's the point. That you just need to follow your soul and and the world's out there.
Yeah, right. That's such an important point. Yes, he literally left Scotland just for about 24 hours into northern England, and that was it. And then he came back, and then, as you say, he's become this global figure with statues around the world, and a good example for all of us. It's not so much where you are physically, as important as that can be. It's more your outlook. Right. You sitting where you're sitting, where I'm sitting, we can be very global in our outset and our mindset, and anyone can do that.
Right.
You can. I think that that's exciting, and I think Burns himself would have been quite amazed by how global his writings have become, but I feel they became global because they were universal principles that he spoke to about.
He did. And what I took away from that, just to be honest, was it actually inspired me after I watched that, because sometimes from what we do, what you do and others do, since you are virtual and you don't really know what's happening, we can't always judge our reach. We can't judge our stickiness. But I come to the point in the conclusion, we don't have to. We just have to believe that it's happening.
Yes.
And as he did, and I guess he's probably the prime example, it happened and still happens. So I think just trust what you're doing and keep saying what you're saying. And somebody will, and today virtually, somebody will reach out and grab it. It will be found.
Yeah, I agree. So agree with that. And you speak from wisdom because you've seen that over the course of your career and your life. And I think both of us, we just see that principle cry out so often. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I think right now with the connections between Scottish businesses, again, in the United States and SBN and my role that I'm playing, it's so important for me to try to help businesses strategize about how they take on this large cake that we've talked about. The idea that Brazil is a huge market, the United States is a huge market. You know very well that Brazil has these different attributes, different regions. United States, Pittsburgh is different from San Francisco, and Pittsburgh is even different from Cleveland. I mean, it's, but the market is so large in the United States. What I often say to businesses is that there will be a draw to the glitz of places like New York City and Washington, D.C., and those are great markets, fantastic opportunities. But think about other areas, St. Louis, think about Denver and Albuquerque,
Austin, that's talking about the, being bold
climate.
And the Silicon Valley.
So they're just, what I'm here to do is to help businesses think about those different markets. It's the entry point into the United States isn't necessarily through the United States. And by that, I mean the infrastructure that exists within states and cities. So major cities in the Midwest or in the Mountain West, and then governor offices, people who are there to help within the state and within the city to help that business. It's not necessarily through the United States government, which can sound intimidating, and understandably so. And so I'm here to help businesses think about that. And then also, Tom, to really focus on the opportunities that exist in Scotland for U.S. businesses to think here are opportunities that exist in Scotland with a very highly trained workforce, great research institutions and universities, real capability for a small country, but lots of innovation. Invest in Scotland and move your headquarters offices, not necessarily to the continent of Europe, but think about Edinburgh or Glasgow Right. So that's the message I also want to carry forward, that Scotland itself is a great opportunity to invest in.
And has a lot of water.
Indeed, yes. Extraordinary amount of water, exactly.
But I think I think it's the great people, it's the friendliness, and it's the culture.
Yes,
it's
true.
It's just so many things.
Yes.
It's a whole basket of opportunities.
Yeah, there are still, with post-Brexit, there are still about 400,000 Europeans or EU citizens that are in Scotland right now. That's a huge number as a percentage of the total population.
Right.
And so it's important for Americans, if they want to understand what's happening in Europe, post-Brexit, et cetera. Well, you have 400,000 EU citizens still in Scotland who are contributing to the economy and the culture. You get a good, deep sense of what's happening in Europe post-Brexit by engaging with Scotland, based on the fact that there are so many Europeans in Scotland. So that's a strategic decision. And aside, as you say, the friendliness and the welcome character of the Scottish people.
Very good. Well, and I want to thank you for sharing your time with us, with our listeners, with the world, and congratulate you on this role with the Scottish Business Network in the U.S. and the cross connections that I'm sure you're going to make, okay?
Well, thank you so much for everything that you do. I much appreciate it.
And for our listeners, you can find more about Ian Houston. That's I-A-N. The last name is Houston. You can find him on LinkedIn. You can find him on the Scottish Business Network, which is sbn.scot. You can also find him, as I mentioned, on the Herald Scotland paper, where he writes his monthly column called The Letter from America. So again, I want to thank our audience and our sponsor, Focus MI Market Intelligence. Focus MI specializes in market research for the Brazilian agricultural market. More about them on their site, which is focusmi.com. Visit our website, talktobrazil.com. Find our previous shows of Talk to Brazil, which are also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, and many more. So remember, when you talk to Tom, you talk to Brazil and the world. Goodbye, and thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to Tom Reaoch on Talk to Brazil, the business connector to Brazil.